Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I just want to let you know that I'm going to be extra careful because I was at a conference a couple of years ago with a stage just like this and a screen over there, completely dark room, and the guy fell off the stage and broke 2 ribs, so I'm just going to stay over here. Try not to let that happen. I'm Eric Socolofsky, front-end engineer at Flickr, and Sean asked me here today to speak about something. This was sort of a transitional period in my life. About a year ago, I was moving from one career to another. And people always say, talk about what you know about, talk about what you do, but I wasn't really sure what I was doing at the time. So I decided instead to focus on a question that's important to me, which is this idea of where good things come from. What kind of processes and culture and people sort of encourage the creation of good things, creative things, innovative products that we can put into the hands of users. So I will be using words today like innovation and inspiration, these big capital I words that make for great corporate clip art, but I don't really want to talk about it in the corporate clip art kind of way. I'd rather actually talk about the things that people make and the way that they make them. Beautiful, usable objects and quality user experiences like generative furniture design by Jessica of Nervous System. Design and engineering of stylish electric bicycles like the Faraday bike. Watercolor maps that are made by Stamen that are available to anyone to use for web and print. Creating immersive video narratives, projecting them onto the buildings like Obscura Digital does, or even thinking about the buildings themselves and the processes of making the buildings and thinking about new materials. I really want to focus on process and culture and the people who make these things. So now that I'm at Flickr, Flickr has such a long history on the internet, I thought it would be interesting to examine the processes and the culture that have allowed Flickr to innovate over the years. So who am I to tell you about innovation? It's funny, I'm marked on the calendar or on the schedule as on the Inspire and the UX UI tracks, but I said I'm a front-end engineer, so how does that fit together? Well, I have a background that's kind of diverse. I started as an architect. I have a background, architectural education, and I worked for a few years as an architect, and it was good for a while, but it was kind of not that great as time went on. Architecture was really difficult to get started in. I ended up going to grad school, a place called Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU. It's a very multidisciplinary program. It brings people together from lots of different spaces like architecture and also fine arts and engineering, dance and music, philosophy, humanities, really from all over. And we spent 2 years together in this one floor in NYU and just kind of bounce ideas off of each other in the areas in which our different disciplines overlap or where all the really creative, inspirational ideas come from. While I was there, Flickr launched. This was February 2004. And Stuart Butterfield, one of the co-founders of Flickr, actually contacted me through one of my professors, Clay Shirky. And he asked me to make some pretty flash things for the then alpha Flickr Live, which was a chat client that predated Flickr proper. So I signed up with Flickr then, and ever since I've been a user. Not the heaviest of users, but definitely a consistent user. I was in New York for a while doing a lot of different things. I worked at a place called IBM in New York. I did a bunch of freelance work. And I ended up getting a job in San Francisco at the Exploratorium, which is a museum of science, art, and human perception in San Francisco. It's a very strong focus on interaction at the Exploratorium. We strive to make scientific phenomena things that you could actually interact with and learn about by interacting with these things. So with this focus on interaction design and then also programming and physical construction and design, I ended up building a lot of different things, like this piece that allows you to manipulate a Voronoi diagram in real time by manipulating the pieces around on the table. It was part of a bigger exhibition about geometry. I did a lot of visualization work, including this interactive visualization of ship traffic moving through San Francisco Bay, and this is actually taken during an America's Cup race, so a lot of the white that you see in there are ships moving back and forth in the Cup race. A piece that shows the world's plankton populations in the oceans. You look through these wood and glass lenses to see what kinds of plankton exist at that location at that time in the ocean. This piece shows a tidal record. Looking out through the windows of the Exploratorium's new location, you can actually see the tides coming in and out, and then you can see each one of these daily tidal records is a piece of laser-cut acrylic. I also made a piece that shows visitors a little bit about the neighborhood of the new Exploratorium. The Exploratorium moved to a new location in 2013, and we wanted to get a better sense of what the neighborhood was like, and we were trying to think, how do we uncover this kind of information? We realized that people, when they take a photograph of something, are ascribing meaning to it. if there's something that's interesting about a thing or a place or a person, and you take a photo of it, then you sort of capture that element, that moment, and that memory. And we realized that by displaying all of these sort of moments of ascribed meaning, we could start to get a cohesive understanding of our neighborhood through the photographs people have taken of the neighborhood. Later that year, that was 2013, I kind of felt like I'd gone as far as I wanted to go at the Exploratorium, and I started looking to try something else out. And I ended up working at Flickr. I knew, though, that it was going to be quite a transition. I was moving from a place where there's this culture of iteration, iterative design, and innovation, and this really core focus on making things quickly, bringing them out to the users, and then iterating on that and building it up into a solid user experience. I wasn't really sure what the culture was like at Flickr, but I wanted to maintain this way of working. So when Sean asked me to speak, this was right when I was transitioning into Flickr, and I decided that it would be interesting to ask this question about how people make these good things as a way of reflecting on how I might bring that culture with me from the Exploratorium to Flickr. So it's really an opportunity for me to learn about how Flickr used to do this kind of work in the past and how we will do this work moving forward. So I took it upon myself to find some people who were at Flickr way back in the day and talk to people who are at Flickr right now and ask them for their stories about how things got done. And that's pretty much what this talk is going to be, is examining that question against the background of the Flickr history and timeline to figure out how we can encourage these new ideas and bring them to users. So the first era of Flickr was from its prototype is this thing called the game never ending to the time that Yahoo acquired it. And this was really the beginning of, this is sort of proto-Web 2.0. So in the beginning, there was Web 1.0. Things were pretty primitive back then. Weblogs were a really huge hit. I don't know if any of you have ever even used the word weblog like in the last 10 years, but this is before people even said blog. They just said weblog. LiveJournal and Blogger and Movable Type were a really huge thing at this point in time. Friendster had just launched. How many of you have a Friendster account? Not a single. Wait, I saw one hand. Right. So yeah, so this is a long fucking time ago is what I'm saying. MySpace and Facebook hadn't even launched yet, 2003. And Stuart Butterfield and Katarina Fake and a handful of other folks at Ludicorp in Vancouver launched this project called The Game Never Ending, which is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game about being social. So it wasn't really a game in the traditional sense of game. It was more just a place to interact with other people with kind of a loose game framework. In fact, Katarina described it as a social object. It's this thing like a board game or a team sport that is an activity around which people gather in order to be social. In fact, modern social software really kind of originated with the communities on Game Never Ending, and then as they matured into the communities on Flickr. One of the popular features of Game Never Ending was something I mentioned earlier, Flickr Live. It's essentially a real-time chat client, but it allowed you to share objects, game objects, and ultimately photos as well. And Stuart and Katarina realized that the photo sharing was actually the strongest part of all of this. So they kind of spun off the photo sharing, this idea of photos as a social lubricant in real-time chat. They removed the real-time part, made it asynchronous, gave you the ability to post photos and then have social communication around these aesthetic objects. And that really formed the foundation of what Flickr is today. So in February 2004, Flickr launched to the public. And there was a huge amount of growth from the very beginning. A lot of new features that kind of heralded the coming of Web 2.0. So this is the very beginning of consumer-level digital photography. This is a Kodak camera developed in 1975, and this is the first digital camera. Not really something that's going to fit in your pocket. You're not going to take it with you on the plane because TSA is going to give you a hell of a time if you try and bring that thing through. But there's all these people who are making digital artifacts, and they didn't know what to do with them. So, what do I do with this huge collection of photos that I have on my little camera? I'm not even sure because I didn't, at this point there was no idea of being able to post photos online. But Flickr launched, people started to get used to that idea, and a lot of features in the beginning kind of formed the backbone of Web 2.0. So one of them was tags. Delicious came up with the idea of tags, and then Flickr borrowed that very shortly after. It's interesting that both Delicious and Flickr were acquired by Yahoo within just a few months of each other. And the great thing about tags is that they're sort of a social stimulus. People tag photos, and then other people look for photos with a certain tag, and they get to know about those photos, and then they get to know about the person who took the photos. And you get this kind of reciprocal community building around the organizational structure of the tags. Sharing media across websites was a completely new thing back then. This idea that weblogs were just for text was really quickly falling away as people started to be able to post photos on this site and on that site and share media across sites. So, this is like, we accept this as just the way the web is now, but it wasn't always that way. The idea of faving was completely new. There was no concept of a social structure within which to ascribe meaning or value to a thing, to say, I like this. It didn't mean anything if there wasn't a social context in which to do it. So faving came around. Another big thing was Ajax. For a lot of the developers in the audience, you probably know what Ajax is or was. It's changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. But it's this idea of being able to the user can make changes to the website, to the data behind the website, without having to refresh the page, which is why would you ever want to refresh the page and interrupt users' experience? That's the way we think about it now, but back then it wasn't even really technically possible until Eric Costello, who was the lead front end on Game Never Ending and Flickr, came up with this way of essentially making a change to just one element in the page. The concept of an API, of a public API, also started with Flickr. This was in August 2004, so shortly after the launch. They released all of their data, all of their public data, to anyone to play with. So people can make things like this visualization by Fernando Villegas and Martin Wattenberg on the left, or one by Eric Fisher on the right. Just by using the data that were available to us, we're able to make beautiful things. We're able to make great apps that improve the user experience, maybe even beyond what the core product is. So it's another thing that we take for granted now, is this ability to have an API. And another technical innovation that Flickr pioneered was this idea of continuous integration, which is the process of pushing code to your site many times a day. We push 10 to 20 times a day, both in the front end and the back end at Flickr. And it's great to be able to do that because we can iterate quickly. We can get little bite-sized pieces out. If there's a problem, it's really tightly scoped, and we can just pull it right back out. As opposed to sort of the way we have to do things with apps right now, which is to push a version out, and then if there's a bug fix you have to release a whole new version and hope people download it. It's this whole process. So continuous integration makes it much easier to keep websites very current and bug-free. And it was enabled by this practice of DevOps, which is also popularized by Flickr. It's the idea that the developers and the operations folks, the people who are responsible for uptime and maintenance and scaling, they work really tightly together. So it's not just developers throwing something over to the fence to operations, and operations says, oh shit, you just took the site down, but it's my job to fix it. That's kind of fucked up. So the developers actually look at these graphs that show uptime and site health and nyan cats and furry woodland creatures. I don't know if you can read that, but the one on the bottom is actually printer usage at Etsy, and it shows you how many woodland creatures you've killed today. So it's important to developers to know about these things in order to keep the site healthy. There's one more core innovation that I think is really critical that Flickr came up with, which is this idea of getting rid of the vowel. I mean, we don't really need that vowel anyway, right? Actually, Flickr with an E was the original name, but the domain name was taken, and the guy wanted to sell it for some astronomical price, so they said, fuck it, we'll just do it this way. So in order to do all these things, Flickr had to be able to prototype them, and prototyping is a really critical aspect of the way you build innovative work and the way you can create it, get it out to users quickly. And the idea started actually in Game Never Ending. The developers built features quickly, they handed them to users, and it was the same process actually that we had at the Exploratorium. So this part of it was already sort of there for me when I arrived at Flickr. At the Exploratorium, we have the shop in the museum, so we can build a prototype very quickly, roll it out the door, have visitors to the museum use the piece, and then roll it back in. If it doesn't work, and we fix it up from there. Flickr was doing this from the beginning, and it was something that Katerina referred to as design by dog paths. The idea that you get prototypes out to the users, and then you watch what they do with them. And the users will form paths between the most common use cases on their own. And then you can design the product around those use cases. So instead of trying to say there's this prescriptive way of using the site, you just sort of let the users figure it out for you. And that's only possible if you're able to stay close to your users. When you prototype and design really quickly, you need to make sure that you have this direct engagement with your users so that you can see how they're using things. And it also actually helps to create a strong community within the users. If they feel like the staff are paying attention to them, then they're also going to take a lot of investment, make a lot of investment in the product themselves and make the whole thing much better. So this is all happening really quickly over the course of just a year, not even a year and a half. And it attracted a lot of attention. So Yahoo came along and said, yeah, that's great, we want that, and we're going to give you $30 million for that, which was not even really that much money back then. But Stuart and Katerina and the Ludacorp folks were like, oh my God, we could do so much with 30 million, so let's do it. And that brings us to the second era, which is the time of the Yahoo acquisition to Katerina and Stuart's departure. So there was a lot of growth during this period. Flickr moved from Flickr Beta to Flickr Gamma to Flickr Loves You. But the first thing that happened during this acquisition, or right after the acquisition, was a 6-month period that was all about integration and scaling and infrastructure. So there were a lot of really busy engineers and then a lot of other people at Flickr who had this downtime. And rather than sit around and do nothing, they used the downtime to think about what they had and think about what they wanted to create. And downtime is really important to being able to create great things. It's a time for free associations and reshuffling your memories, discovering new connections. And the folks at Flickr were able to take advantage of this time to start to think about ways that they could create features to allow people to explore all the content that was created on the site. So the core functionality was there, but they were starting to think about what people could do with that core functionality. One of the first things was the commons on Flickr. It was the idea of George Oates, one of the original designers on Flickr. And she thought of this idea of bringing institutions into Flickr to share their public domain images. It started with the US Library of Congress, and there's a ton of other institutions. There's actually 100 as of last month. The British Library, the Internet Archive Book Images Project. And this is a photograph by the Library of Congress, or from the Library of Congress, that shows a real-life Rosie the Riveter. Are you familiar with the image of Rosie the Riveter? The kind of iconic World War II poster of a woman flexing her muscle, and much bigger one than mine, and showing how she could help out the war effort. And this is the real thing. This is an actual, real Rosie the Riveter, and it's a beautiful photo to boot. So it's great to have all this stuff freely available on the commons. Another thing that came out of this downtime was the idea of geo and maps features, and they kind of actually had their origin with the users. So there were tags, and there was a certain syntax that users came up with called machine tags that allowed them to more carefully categorize content and find it via search. And the machine tag syntax ended up morphing into a geotag syntax, so you can put your latitude and longitude, and then that was actually canonicalized by Flickr. The developers at Flickr said, wait a minute, this is really solid. We can actually turn this into something that belongs in every photo and build all these maps features out of it. And one of my favorite features on Flickr is one that's unfortunately really hidden right now. It's not linked to from anywhere on the site. It's flickr.com/places. You should definitely check it out, but you have to enter the URL on your own, unfortunately, for now. There's over 100,000 places pages, and each one of them represents the photos and the people and the groups that focus on a particular place in the world. And it's for all over the world, so it's a really great way to see the world through the photographs people have taken of the world. Also in 2005, the Explore page launched, and this was a way to start to curate, sort of semi-automatically curate all of this content that was coming across Flickr using the social metadata around each photo. So the popular photos would bubble up and appear on the Explore page. All these features came about because of Flickr's ability to iterate on them. So they all started as kind of small experiments. They were pushed out behind what we call feature flippers, which are flags in the code that allow us to turn things on or off. And they would turn things on to a group of users, listen to the feedback, and then pull it back in, iterate on it, release a new version. This is also something we did a lot at the Exploratorium. I mentioned the shop was in-house. So we'd prototype, bring it on the floor, get feedback, then bring it back into the shop, rebuild it, change it. If it wasn't working out, we would just nuke the idea altogether, but eventually iterate up to a full-featured experience for our visitors. So during this time, Flickr was also going through a lot of growth. The core features were building to the point where there were all these different ways to display and organize your photos, like the photo stream in sets and collections and galleries and group pools. There were all these different ways to communicate with other members, like the forum and groups and comments and notes and Flickr mail. So the site is getting more and more complex and more robust. And in the meantime, it's growing exponentially. There were around 10 million public photos in April 2005. It was up to 200 million by mid-2006. And then 2 billion images by the end of 2007. So over just 2.5 years, it was 200 times growth, which is kind of, astounding and probably intimidating for the people who were working at Flickr at that time. But rather than sort of disassociate themselves from all this content, they took on this role of being the caretaker of the content. They wanted to make sure that these photos would be available to your grandchildren, so that your grandchildren 2 generations from now could look at photographs of their grandparents when they were kids that their parents had posted. So this idea of not just kind of letting the users do things, but actually having responsibility to the users was really important to the teams at Flickr. And that was enabled by having all of the different roles present at the product direction meetings. There were product people there, obviously, but there were also designers, and there were front-end engineers and back-end engineers, community managers. And this idea of small teams is a really critical one to ensure that you have an attention to detail and quality. The small team should be cross-functional, so people can have all of the different roles represented. And there was this mantra of small teams being able to do bigger things than big teams, which I still think is very valid. If you have a small team, you're going to have easier and more consistent communication. Your ideas will flow quicker, and less things will fall between the cracks because everyone is there with their own responsibility. So the folks leading these small teams at the time were Stuart Butterfield on the left and Katarina Fake on the right. And after the Yahoo acquisition, Katarina went on to found the Brick House idea incubator at Yahoo. And Stuart stayed behind as really the sole leader of Flickr. And there's always a lot of contention about whether a leader of this is valuable or a leader of that is actually a good person or kind of a dick, as Kim was talking about in the last one. But almost everyone I talked to said that Stuart was a really great guy who had a really strong vision. And having a leader that has this strong vision and this idea to communicate his vision or her vision and ensure that everyone working on the product is sort of contributing to a cohesive direction for the product is really critical. It's a difficult thing to find. Visionary leadership is few and far between, but if you find someone who you feel is a really strong leader, then take advantage of that and stick with that person. And if you feel it within yourself, then cultivate that and work with others to help you bring that out. But unfortunately, people move on. Katarina hit the road in 2008 of June, and Stuart left 1 month after in July. So what would become of Flickr without this centralizing force and the strong leadership? That brings us to the third era, which was from the time that those two left to Marissa Mayer taking over as CEO of Yahoo. And this was a difficult time for Flickr. There was still a lot of growth, but there were storm clouds in the horizon. Very literal metaphor. Did you get it? There was a generational shift. Stuart and Katarina left, and there were all these other people who said, well, if they're leaving, maybe it's time for me to go try something else too. There was also a growing lack of attention and resources from Yahoo. And the world was changing rapidly around Flickr. There were things like mobile and local and real-time that were really taking the scene. Mobile photography was not a new thing anymore, and Instagram in 2010 really dominated that. GPS and phones gave rise to location-based apps like Foursquare in 2009. And real-time, the ability to share your thoughts in real time, to share news in real time, obviously Twitter has been the leader in that since 2006. And they matured from an SMS application to a full-featured mobile app in 2010. So there's all these things happening that Flickr and Yahoo weren't really keeping up with. And part of the problem here was that there were 4 CEOs in 3.5 years. So there's all this churn happening. It's really difficult to tell who was sailing the ship or even where the ship was going. But despite the turbulence, Flickr had already established itself as a place for people to come make great things. And people stayed because they were passionate about what Flickr had been. And new people joined because they were passionate about what they could turn Flickr into in the future. So passion, as represented by passion fruit, because if you ever try and find a slide for passion, you're going to find some questionable things, especially if you search on Flickr with safe search off. It's not the easiest thing to find in people, right? Like passion, I think there's a lot of passionate people here at FITC, which is one of the reasons that we're all here to share that. But it's hard to find often. And it's great, though, when you do, because you find people with this drive to create that comes from a personal interest in the things that they're making. People bring their own ideas to the table, and then they have ownership of those ideas, and that ownership, in turn, motivates them to maintain quality of the things that they're creating. So during this time, one of the acts of passion that is near and dear to my heart is, that's not a great shot of an ASCII cat. This is the code blog on Flickr. It's code.flickr.net, and it's a place for developers at Flickr to share all the things that they're doing with the public. So the things that we do that we're passionate about, we're able to put out in the world and bounce off of people in the real world. So it's a place for us to share our ideas with the public, but also to hear what other people think about our ideas. And it's also a place to share our behind-the-scenes processes and recruit people to come help out. And the passion was contagious. there was this project called the Purple Petals, or the Flickr bikes, or Yahoo bikes, depending on who you talk to. And it was this fleet of bicycles that had a Nokia N95 camera phone strapped to the handlebars. There's an accelerometer in the back with some solar panels to power everything. And as you start moving, it'll automatically geotag and upload photos to Flickr. So you get this kind of stream of consciousness through space that exists on Flickr. And this actually, coincidentally, was a project by a group of people called Uncommon Projects. And that was a team of people who came out of my grad school, out of ITP. So kind of full circle, you see this way of thinking and working that starts to overlap in other areas. But one of the difficult things about passion is that if you don't have a shared vision and strong leadership to help you sort of coordinate everything, you can end up with a total mess. This sort of unbridled passion is going to end up with experiments that may be interesting in their own right, but don't necessarily cohere into an overall product. They can complicate the user experience. They can, and I'm speaking from experience, become maintenance headaches. So, that said, there were still a lot of great things that came out of this era. There's people tagging, which was done in a much more thoughtful way than Facebook had done it previously. There's a new web uploader, which is still pretty solid. There's a lot of new geo features that came out. And this brings us to today, which is all about making Flickr awesome again. So, a little context. As of the end of 2014, there were about 10 billion photos on Flickr, 100 million unique users, and 7.5 million uploads a day. So that's a little over 5,000 uploads per second, which is a staggering amount of photos, but it's actually nothing compared to the entire web, which sees 2 billion photos uploaded per day to Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and WhatsApp and Flickr. So that's 20%. That's 1/5 of Flickr's entire corpus is uploaded every day. Mobile surpassed desktop, as we all know, over the last couple of years. There's higher user expectations about the quality of the products that they use, and there's real competition has developed for Flickr. There's sites like Exposure and 500 Pixels. And it got to the point, actually, in 2012 where people were saying that Flickr was dead and that Yahoo killed it. I think probably some of you have read the article by Matt Honan in Wired that detailed a lot of the trials and tribulations of the era that I just described to you. But people still cared. Marissa took over in 2012, and one day later, Sean Bonner posted this site that I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It says, "Dear Marissa Mayer, please make Flickr awesome again." It got picked up by social media, and people really kind of took up that rallying cry and said, "Marissa, pay attention. This is a thing that was awesome once. We want it to be awesome again." And people at Flickr agreed and disagreed, said, "Yeah, come help us make it awesomer, because we're still pretty awesome." So whether or not you agreed with that at the time, people at Flickr were still really devoted to their product. And we've entered into a period where we're doing a ton of construction. There's been this renewed investment, thanks to Marissa and other people at Yahoo, back in Flickr, and a reciprocal renewed relationship with Yahoo. So we've been focusing on reinvigorating and catching up and trying to get back to a place where it's simple to upload and organize and find your photos, to share and engage the community around your photos, to discover new content, and to once again become the eyes of the world. Flickr had a motto that was founded, and then it came up in 2006. Stuart said, it's the eyes of the world. It's a place for us to see the world through the photographs that people have taken of the world. And this is a place that we're very quickly coming back to being able to be. That said, it's been difficult to focus on iteration and innovation during this time because we're so working at a breakneck pace to try to get back into a good position. We have been able to do some technical innovation. We rebuilt the foundation for the front end. So for the developers in the audience, we're now on an isomorphic Node.js single-page application. For the rest of you, what? Basically what it comes down to is that we have a modern stack on the front end. Makes page loads and navigation a lot faster. We have more flexibility and ability to iterate. And we have the ability to attract top-notch developers now who want to work with cutting-edge technologies like these. And we're also doing a similar renovation on the back end. It's a little too early to discuss the details, but there's this sort of front-to-back complete rebuilding of what Flickr is. And we're able to do that thanks to Agile Development. I'm not going to stress the benefits of Agile that much because, I don't know, it's great, whatever, but it's work. I don't know. The concept, though, of Agile is that you have 1 to 2 week-long sprints, and you have a daily scrum where you kind of keep track of everything that's been happening. So you kind of scope out what you're going to do in a short period of time, and you just knock it out. And it's great for plowing through tasks, but it's not really good for experimentation because there's no downtime, there's no margins. If you want to iterate, you have to bake that into your estimates. So it's great for just going in a very sort of linear direction, but it's not good for just dreaming up new ideas. That said, we do have margins and we do have opportunity to experiment. I don't know how many of you have seen this XKCD comic that came out towards the end of last year, where there's a guy talking to his programmer friend and he says, I want you to make an app for me where I can see if a photo that I upload was taken in a park. She's like, yeah, sure, no problem, GS lookup. And he says, and if it has a bird in it. She says, okay, sure, give me a research team in 5 years. And the point of the comic is to illustrate how there's some things in computer science that are super easy and some things that are really difficult, and it's kind of hard to get a grip on which ones are which. But the team at Flickr, our vision and search team, computer vision and search team, said, wait a minute, we can already do this now. And in a couple weeks, they whipped together this microsite that allows you to drag and drop a photo into this dotted box, and it'll tell you whether it was taken in a park and whether or not it has a bird. And it works. You should check it out. It's parkorbird.flickr.com. So we got some fun attention on that one. We also have done a lot. We have sort of a renewed focus on exploring the data around all of the photos that people upload. There's a subset of the Flickr team that explicitly devotes their time to exploration. The data science team made this thing we call the grid, which is an internal tool that makes it much simpler for anyone to ask either simple or complex questions of the data that we have. So, for example, someone made a blog post. His name is Bautik. One of my coworkers made a blog post last year investigating trends in camera usage on Flickr. And it's interesting to see that smartphones are increasingly dominant, even on Flickr, which is a site that nominally is for professional photographers or whatever, but really it's for anyone who wants to give a little bit of thought to their photograph and share it with people. And we use the tools that we have, and these currently are the tools that we have. There's also a group called Yahoo Labs, and there's a section of Yahoo Labs that's embedded at Flickr. And their mission is to explore technologies for the long term, so sort of 2 to 5 years out. This piece is called Regionizer. It uses geodata and statistical analysis to create descriptive outlines based on the tags of photos that people have uploaded. So what you can do is you can look at a set of photos that are tagged with I think you can see sort of Ontario is the blue chunk up there. And you start to get a sense of what people in the world think the boundaries of their places are. So when you look at geopolitical boundaries, it's not quite as interesting because those are defined on a map, but if you think about something like the Midwest or the South, these are American regions, you start to get these shapes that are defined by the kind of psychogeography of people who are living in these places or visiting these places. We also have photo recommendations that launched recently, which is it has a lot of makes use of computer vision and also the social signals and the metadata around the photos. There's group recommendations, there's suggested tags are launching. We're improving our interestingness algorithms so the Explore page gets better. So there's all these sort of cross-disciplinary problems that we're trying to solve. And in order to solve these problems, we have to have a diverse team. So diversity is another one of these things that's really critical to being able to create innovative work. And it's not something that just happens. You really have to work to make it happen. The Labs group, for example, has people from a really diverse range of backgrounds and skill sets and interests, from artificial intelligence to human-computer interaction to InfoViz to geo to computer vision. There's this broad range. And it's actually the same premise on which ITP, my grad school, was founded, is that if you bring all these different kinds of people together and put them in a room, amazing things are going to come out of that. But to achieve diversity on a team, if you're trying to put together a team of diverse people, you have to make sure that you go out and network around all these multiple disciplines. They're not just going to come to you. You have to make an active effort to sort of spread yourself out and pull everyone in. And within the team, once you get a diverse team, you have to make sure that you encourage this concept of diversity as a great thing. People need to embrace the friction between each other and not fight it, because that friction is what ignites the spark that creates the next new idea. So by embracing the successes of the past and employing new techniques and new technologies, we're growing back into a healthy, mature product. We're regaining this place in the timeline that we should have been all along. And we have a lot of new ideas that are on the near horizon. So in talking to people about how to achieve these new ideas, I found that there's a couple primary trends, a couple sort of different paths to creating innovative work. One of them is this idea of following a linear path toward a solution that you know has a very high probability of succeeding. I call this deductive innovation. It's the idea that you sort of just aim for the thing you want and you figure out how to get there as you go, and then you get there and you nail it. And this is really a dominant way of thinking in the tech industry right now. I live in San Francisco, and San Francisco is in turn dominated by the tech industry, so it's often difficult to think outside of this, and it's really infuriating sometimes. But it's gotten to the point now where in the tech scene, this way of thinking is so dominant that it's almost a caricature. I have a coworker who put together this great site called LaunchNickcom. It's LaunchNiKeKam. And it's the world's first entirely AI startup accelerator. So you go here and you push a button and you'll get your startup mapped out for you from start to finish. If you want the Uber of pants or the Uber of cheese or the Uber of headbands, we'll deliver. I think it's funny. You should check it out. But despite the caricature, end results often are functional and successful. So it is a really valid way of thinking about things. They may not be wildly innovative, though, and they tend to be iterations on existing products. So the other path towards innovation is, instead of a linear path, to try lots of quick prototypes, lots of little experiments. I call this inductive innovation. You experiment and you iterate, and eventually you end up with a solution that may have a lower probability of solving a specific problem, but it's much more likely to generate new use cases and really open up the playing field to new ways of thinking. So when you work this way, you end up with emergent behavior. When you follow this path of inductive innovation, and you create lots of little things, and you throw them over the fence to users and then see what happens, they're going to start to do things with all these bits and pieces that you never anticipated. I think the example of tags turning into machine tags, turning into geotags, and then turning into all the geo features on Flickr, the maps and the places pages, is a great example of that. But an even better example is Flickr itself. Flickr has really always been a series of experiments in digitally mediated social interaction, and it evolved into this new language of social software on the web. So how do you decide which one to choose? Depending on your path, you can choose either one. It really depends on what your situation is right now. And Flickr's at an interesting point in time now where both paths are useful. The linear deductive innovation path to get us back on track and on solid footing, from which we can start to do more experiments and perform this inductive innovation to invent the future. So that's about it. I'd like to give special thanks to all the folks that I interviewed, and especially to you for sitting here and listening to me for this whole time. Please get in touch. Thanks. I also want to mention that my slides are up at that URL if you want to check them out with all the notes. And also we're hiring, flickr.com/jobs. So I think we have time for questions, right? Yep.
Have you had any success breaking people out of that deductive kind of reasoning and getting them more to embrace that experimental inductive reasoning style?
The question was, have I had any success in getting people to embrace the inductive style of innovation? You mean at Flickr, right? Or do you mean in general?
At Flickr or just in the engineering community at San Fran?
So it's a hard thing to do at Flickr right now because we're so heads down rebuilding. And I would say that I haven't gotten people to embrace that at a high level yet, at a sort of directional level. But the people that I work with on a regular basis, I think, are very excited. I mean, I've put together a lot of experiments in my own time and in my margins at Flickr. And people are excited about that, and they really want to see those start to blossom into more full features. So it's a step-by-step process, and it takes a lot of time, especially when I'm migrating from a culture that focuses primarily on experimentation to a culture that focuses on just getting shit done. And it takes time to get people to think in different ways, but it's working slowly, yeah. This one back there.
How do you see, in the near future, how do you see Flickr integrating kind of like up-and-coming technologies such as like VR or kind of like AR?
So the question was, how do I see Flickr integrating up-and-coming technologies like VR, AR?
Where do you see that?
I don't. Not VR and AR. I mean, I think that there's a lot of other up-and-coming technologies like computer vision that we're making a huge amount of use of. Working with data at scale is a really big thing for a lot of places right now that have a ton of user-generated content. You look at the kinds of questions that Facebook is able to ask and answer, and it's like magic. I mean, they have so much data that they're able to think of problems that that no one else would really know existed unless they had the ability to inspect the data. And Flickr's doing the same kinds of things. It's always a little bit of a fine line because Facebook doesn't really give a shit about people's privacy, and they'll ask whatever questions they want, whereas it's always been something important to Flickr to be able to improve the experience while respecting people's content and their settings. But to your question about other technologies, I think a lot of it is sort of currently around infrastructural technologies that allow us to ask more difficult questions, but less about presentational technologies like AR and VR. Any others? All right. Thank you.